Assalamu alaikum. Evidence-based medicine. That's where our guidelines come from. And before we start, let me remind you that that's exactly what they are. Guidelines. The yellow brick road. Where you can get lost into the poppy fields, meet with the heartless tin man, the brainless scarecrow, as well as the lion who lost all of his courage, in this case, to speak the truth. And if you walk the whole way, you're going to meet the Wizard of Oz. And of course, we all know how that story ended. Let's start at the very beginning and take drugs as an example. These are the 5 steps to the development of any drug molecule. This is actually a snapshot from the FDA online website, and it looks very legit. Step 1, drug discovery and development. Step 2, preclinical research. Step 3, clinical research. Step 4, FDA review of the drug molecule. Step 5, post-market safety monitoring. A very long and tedious process, right? But actually, it is extremely fragile on so many levels, starting with man's conscience. 1/3 of new drugs are impregnated with problems that come to life after the FDA has approved them. What a lot of us don't know is that the FDA has been long since known for scandals throughout its history. Most men fail when tested for money and power, and evidently women as well. FDA's commissioner for 6 years covered up facts about drugs that she knew could be deadly. A 30-second search with a slow internet connection on Search Global Research turned up 4,030 results on the evils of Big Pharma. Go ahead, search for yourself, search Google, and try other wording phrases. I don't know how many of you have heard about the Bayer scandal, where the company knowingly sold HIV-contaminated blood products to third world countries, knowing full well that a good number of the hemophiliacs were just children, but that did not interfere with their lust for money and business profits. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone specific, but you know that famous declaration, "I have no conflicts of interest." Well, turns out that some get post hoc earnings and or research support, which doesn't necessarily come from the makers of drugs that their panels voted to approve, but it also can come from their competitors. And guess what? Not all physicians are honored equally. An example case pertaining to 107 physicians, 41 received no payment, 26 received between 1,000 to 10,000, 14 received from 10 to 100,000, 20 received 100,000 to $1 million, while 6 reached the primo of more than $1 million. And this just goes on and on. In 2009, an anonymous certified letter was sent from inside the FDA to President Obama describing, quote, systemic corruption and wrongdoing that permeates all levels of FDA, unquote. Now let's take a step back and size up the peer reviewing process. Well, turns out that a journal's impact factor, is an inconsistent way to judge a paper. Peer reviewers exhibiting the human error factor decide on which papers get published and which not in the first place, either consciously or subconsciously. And whether out of good or maleficent intent, they could extinguish valuable and impactful research from ever reaching light. Which is why readers are well advised to judge all articles for themselves, irrespective of any peer review designation. Fact remains, peer review is a much more random process than we would like to admit. Most published research findings are simply accurate measures of prevailing bias. And to add to the entropy of things, spurious correlations also have a saying in this. The more ice cream eaten, the greater number of shark attacks, the greater number of teeth lost in children, the greater the vocab size. The more appliances people have in their homes in Taiwan, the fewer children they have. Take a look at this graph. It shows us that U.S. spending on science correlates with suicides committed by hanging. The more cheese people eat, the more likely they are to die by becoming entangled in their bed sheets. And this graph, it shows a 99% correlation between couples eating margarine and the more likelihood of their getting a divorce. So let's take the time out right now to issue a warning to all married couples living in Maine to avoid butter consumption at all costs because it's not good for their marriage. The dire consequences of being smart with evil intention is that we can use our scientific tools to lie our way into any deductions. And this is just an example.
Technique is showing just a moment. We see this when we're using a bar graph, when really a line graph would be more appropriate. Let's look at this graph. We're measuring the current distance traveled, and we're comparing Carl and Samantha. When we look at this bar graph, we see that Carl is beating out Samantha, and we would assume that Carl is always going to be ahead of Samantha. But now let's look at this situation with a line graph that's going to show us their distance over time. Looking at Carl's graph, he got off to a very quick start, and then he's really leveled off. But now if we look at Samantha's graph, she is speeding up as she goes. And although she hasn't quite caught up to Carl yet, if we extend this out further, we can see that she's going to pass him very soon. And if their pace continues like this, she's going to end up going much further.
Peer review fraud. A p-value. P-value is another example of a tool which is the intent of its editor. Quoting Ron Wasserstein, Executive Director of the American Statistical Association, we fear the p-value is used as a gatekeeper for determining what's publishable research, unquote. This means that good research with higher p-values is being turned away, and the reverse. Bad research exploits p-value hacking to make the research appear statistically significant, publishable, and guidelines material. And it's not just the p-value. We have unethical behavior, unethical trials. And did you know that 29% of all clinical trials are never even reported? Perhaps something like an undesired effect could result in the wiping out of trial information, what was done, what was found, the lives of volunteers that were affected, and of no avail, only to put other volunteers at risk at another duplicate trial, all in the name of science.
Universities, health organizations, everybody that I've encountered in my former career as a pharmaceutical executive are out there with their hands out. You know, everybody's begging for money. Nobody has any money. The government doesn't have any money. Universities don't have money. Nobody's money. The only ones that have money are these big multinational corporations. And they have lots of money. And they use that money to basically buy influence. And the way it's done is, number one, you give these organizations and institutions grants for various kinds of research. You do develop research together with them. You establish friends. You make sure that they become beholden to you. And you also pay individual professors and doctors and researchers directly. You may pay them as speakers to travel around the country, $1,000, $2,000 per day, sometimes more. You give them money for programs, that the educational programs where they can make a profit, and then they put on these programs, and they're supposed to be third party independent from the company, which is all fine. But as you and I can both imagine, if you have a promotional budget at a corporation, you're probably going to give that money to the universities that do the programs that most support your drug. And the ones that don't, or are critical in any shape, way, or form, they're not going to get anything. And everybody obviously knows that this is how things work. And that means that even if you can officially claim, well, this is arm's length, we didn't have anything to do with it, we just gave them a grant, they can do whatever they want with it. Reality is, they're not going to continue to get money unless they're saying what you want them to say. They know it, you know it. It's only maybe the public that doesn't know it. And that's how you influence the medical establishment, simply with money.
My name is Peter Goetje. I'm a director of the Nordic Cochrane Center in Copenhagen and professor of research design and analysis at the University of Copenhagen. 2 years ago, I found out that our prescription drugs are the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. Our drugs kill around 200,000 people in America every year, and half of these people die while they do what their doctors told them. So they die because of the side effects. The other half die because of errors. And it's often the doctors that make the errors, because any drug may come with 20, 30 or 40 warnings, contraindications, precautions, and so on. No doctor in the world knows about all this. So they give patients drugs that they should not have given them, that interact dangerously with other drugs or food items or so on. And then the patients die. That's the other half. So the other thing I found out 2 years ago was that much of what the drug industry does fulfills the criteria for organized crime in US law. And they behave in many ways like the mafia does. They corrupt everyone they can corrupt. They have bought every type of person, even including ministers of health in some countries. So there is a huge amount of corruption. In my country, for example, Denmark, we are regarded as having very little corruption. But yet we have thousands of doctors on industry payroll, although we are just 20,000 doctors. So this is an effective kind of corruption. The drug industry buys the professors first, then chiefs of department, then other chief physicians and so on. They don't buy junior doctors. So when several thousands are on industry payroll, it's really, really bad. And that's why I wrote my book, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare. I hope to convince patients not to take so many drugs, because so many die from the drugs they take. In my country, people take so many drugs that every single citizen can be in treatment with 1.5 drugs from they are born till they die. This is incredible. And drugs are not that helpful. And they kill very many of us. We know that. That's why drugs are the third major killer after heart disease and cancer. So what we need in the coming years is to take far fewer drugs than what we do currently. If we did that and we were careful, then we could live longer and live better lives. Because drugs have many side effects, and patients often don't realize that when they become worse, that it could be a side effect of the drug, which they continue taking because that's what their doctors tell them. So when I was a specialist in internal medicine, what I very often did was that I stopped a lot of drugs, particularly in elderly people. And it's quite revealing to see a bedridden elderly person come into your ward. And when you stop the drugs, I mean, that person becomes many years younger. And many of these drugs affect the brain. And old people tolerate that very, very badly. They fall, and when they break a hip, 1/4 of them die. And for example, antidepressant drugs are used in more than 10% of our elderly. And they seem to kill 3% of them every year. I mean, if 100 old people take an antidepressant for 1 year, 3% of them will die because they fall and break their hip. This is a huge death rate. So a lot of other drugs than antidepressants also make people fall and kill them. And they may affect your cognition, your memory, and all these things. And then they interact in ways that we know almost nothing about. Very many elderly, they take more than 5 drugs a day. and we actually don't know how these drugs interact with each other. What we do know is that all drugs have many effects in the body, and some of them interact also in their metabolism, so that you can get a too high concentration of a drug if you take other drugs simultaneously. So we make a lot of harms that we don't even recognize. I have a pretty colorful collection of things people have called me during all these years. And sometimes journalists have asked me, why do you always look up controversy? And my reply is, I don't. Controversy looks me up. Because it's not popular to tell the truth in healthcare. You will get a lot of enemies, because a lot of people make money on false premises, doctors and industry alike. And our drug regulators and our politicians, they are on board on this wagon. So very few people are independent of money in healthcare. And of course, I have attacked a lot of holy cows during my career, and people have screamed loudly. In a French journal, I was called a statistical masturbist because I showed with statistics that mammography screening didn't work and things like that. And I was even accused of scientific misconduct by the Association of the Danish Pharmaceutical Industry, which was completely ludicrous. It was harassment from beginning to end. They came with vague arguments that we cannot recognize the conclusions in your study, and they could have come up with numbers and said, these numbers are wrong. They didn't do anything. It was only harassment. It lasted 18 months, I think, the whole thing. And then when we were acquitted, I made sure that this nasty behavior was described in the British Medical Journal. So after that, they haven't come so much after me, the Danish drug industry. And when my book about organized crime came out, they just lied about it, as they always do. That my examples were old, they went back 90 years and so on. But, you know, where I demonstrate that what the 10 biggest companies do is organized crime. These examples, they were from within the last 10 to 15 years. That's not old examples. And the crimes have increased because when crime pays, you will have more crime. That's how capitalism works.
In the end, when you are sitting in your practice and considering a management plan for your patient, think and ponder before lifting your pen. Treatment is not a procedure or a drug prescription. Your patient is much more than a labeled disease. Your patient is body and soul, and is worth all the effort you spend high and low searching for a true untainted cure. Western medicine, Eastern medicine, folklore medicine even, always search with an open mind and a judgmental eye. In the end, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I hope this presentation will change your perspective about your medical practice. Please share it and pass it on.